I'm 29F and my brother Daniel is 32M. We grew up pretty close despite the 3-year age gap. Our parents divorced when I was 8 and Daniel was 11, and we kind of became each other's support system through all the custody battles and drama that followed. Our dad remarried pretty quickly after the divorce and had 2 more kids with his new wife. He was never really present for Daniel and me after that. Our mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat and did her best, but money was always tight. The one bright spot in our childhood was our maternal grandmother, Nana Rose. She lived about 20 minutes away, and we'd spend every weekend at her house. She had this amazing old Victorian home with a huge garden, and she'd teach us how to bake and garden and tell us stories about our family history. Nana Rose was also pretty well off. Her late husband had been a successful businessman, and she'd invested wisely over the years. She always told Daniel and me that we were her special grandchildren because we were the ones who spent time with her and really cared about her. When Nana Rose started getting sick about 5 years ago, Daniel and I took turns helping her out. I'd drive her to doctor's appointments and grocery shopping, while Daniel would handle yard work and home repairs. We both lived close by and made sure she was never alone for too long. About 3 years ago, Nana Rose was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. She was still pretty sharp most of the time, but she'd have moments of confusion and started forgetting things more frequently. That's when she decided to get her affairs in order. She asked Daniel and me to meet with her and her attorney to discuss her will and estate planning. Nana Rose told us she was leaving her house and the majority of her assets to Daniel and me, split equally. The house was worth about $400,000 and she had another $300,000 in various investments and savings accounts. She wanted to set up a trust that would pay for her care needs, and whatever was left after her death would be divided between us. She also wanted to give us each access to a joint account with $40,000 that we could use for emergencies, or if we needed help with major expenses. The attorney explained that the joint account would require both our signatures for withdrawals over $5,000, but either of us could access smaller amounts independently. Nana Rose said she trusted us to be responsible and look out for each other. I was overwhelmed by her generosity. Daniel seemed excited too, and we both promised to continue taking care of her and make sure the money was used responsibly. For the next year and a half, everything went smoothly. Nana Rose's condition gradually worsened, but we managed to keep her in her own home with the help of part-time caregivers. The trust covered all her medical expenses and care costs. Daniel and I each used the joint account a couple of times for legitimate purposes. I took out $8,000 to help with a major car repair when my transmission died. Daniel used $12,000 toward a down payment on a new apartment when his lease was up. About 18 months ago, Nana Rose's dementia progressed to the point where she needed full-time care. We made the difficult decision to move her to a memory care facility. She passed away peacefully in her sleep about 8 months ago. The funeral was small but nice. Daniel gave a beautiful eulogy about how much Nana Rose had meant to both of us and how grateful we were for everything she'd done for our family. After the funeral, the attorney contacted us about settling the estate. As expected, the house and remaining assets were to be split between Daniel and me. After all the care costs and estate expenses, we were each inheriting about $280,000. The attorney said it would take a few months to get everything sorted out, but we should expect to receive our inheritance checks by early this year. In December, I got a call from the attorney saying there was a problem. When they went to close out the joint account that Nana Rose had set up for us, they discovered that it had been almost completely drained over the past 8 months. Someone had been making regular withdrawals, always just under the $5,000 threshold that required both signatures. The account, which should have had about $20,000 left in it, was down to $1,200. I was confused and told the attorney that I hadn't made any withdrawals recently. He said they'd need to investigate and would get back to me with more information. A week later, the attorney called back with copies of all the withdrawal slips. Every single unauthorized withdrawal had Daniel's signature on it. Over 8 months, he'd taken out nearly $19,000 in small increments. I was shocked. Daniel had been stealing from our grandmother's account while she was dying in a care facility. I called Daniel immediately and confronted him about the withdrawals. At first, he tried to deny it, saying there must be some mistake. When I told him the attorney had copies of his signatures, he went quiet for a long time. Finally, he admitted that he'd been taking money from the account. He said he'd been going through a rough patch financially and had always planned to pay it back before anyone noticed. I asked him what kind of rough patch required $19,000. He said he'd had some unexpected medical bills and his car had needed major repairs. He promised he'd pay back every penny once we got our inheritance. Something about his story didn't add up. Daniel had decent health insurance through his job, and I'd never heard him mention any serious medical issues. Plus, $19,000 seemed like way too much for car repairs. I told him I needed time to think about the situation and that we'd need to discuss it more later. Daniel's behavior over the next few weeks made me even more suspicious. He'd always been pretty social, and we'd usually talk or text several times a week. Suddenly, he was avoiding my calls and giving short, evasive answers when I tried to reach him. I also noticed that he'd stopped posting on social media, which was unusual for him. When I drove past his apartment complex one day, I saw that his car wasn't in his usual parking spot. I started asking around with some of our mutual friends to see if anyone knew what was going on with Daniel. Most people said they hadn't heard from him much lately either. Then I ran into his coworker Jake at the grocery store. Jake and Daniel worked together at a construction company and had been friends for several years. When I asked Jake how Daniel was doing, he got this uncomfortable look on his face. He said Daniel had actually been fired from his job about 10 months ago for showing up late and missing work repeatedly. I was stunned. Daniel had been unemployed for 10 months and never told me. That explained why he'd been taking money from Nana Rose's account, but it still didn't explain why he'd lost his job in the first place. Jake seemed reluctant to say more, but when I pressed him, he admitted that he thought Daniel might have a gambling problem. He said Daniel had been talking about going to the casino a lot and had borrowed money from several coworkers that he'd never paid back. Everything suddenly made sense. Daniel hadn't been taking money for medical bills or car repairs. He'd been feeding a gambling addiction. I felt sick. Our grandmother had trusted us with that money, and Daniel had been stealing it to gamble while she was literally dying. I tried calling Daniel again, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I drove to his apartment, and his landlord told me that Daniel had been evicted 3 weeks earlier for not paying rent. The landlord said Daniel had been behind on rent for months before they finally kicked him out. He'd been making partial payments and promising to catch up, but it never happened. Nobody knew where Daniel was living. I didn't hear from him for another month. Then, in February, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Daniel, and he sounded terrible. He said he needed to see me and that it was important. He asked if he could come over to my apartment to talk. When Daniel showed up at my door, I barely recognized him. He'd lost probably 30 pounds and looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, and he had this desperate, haunted look in his eyes. He immediately started apologizing and begging for forgiveness. He admitted that he developed a serious gambling problem over the past couple of years and that he'd been taking money from Nana Rose's account to cover his losses and debts. He said it started small, just occasional trips to the casino with coworkers. But then he'd had a big win early on that made him think he could make easy money. Of course, the wins stopped coming, but he kept chasing them. Daniel told me he'd actually been gambling for almost 2 years, but it really spiraled out of control after Nana Rose went into the care facility. At first, he was still working and using his paycheck to gamble. But when he started missing work because he'd been out all night at the casino, his boss gave him several warnings. Eventually, they had to let him go because he was unreliable. After he lost his job, Daniel said he'd tried to live off his savings and credit cards for a couple months, but that money ran out fast. That's when he started taking from the joint account, first just to pay bills, but then more and more of it was going to gambling. He kept telling himself that if he could just hit a big jackpot, he could pay everything back and nobody would ever know. By the time Nana Rose died, Daniel was in deep with some loan sharks who'd been fronting him money to gamble with. The interest rates were insane, and the debt kept growing even when he was making payments. He'd lost his apartment because he'd been using his rent money to make debt payments and gamble, hoping to win enough to catch up on everything. Daniel said he'd tried to stop gambling several times, but he always convinced himself that just one more big win would solve all his problems. Instead, he just dug himself in deeper. He told me that he currently owed about $75,000 to various creditors and loan sharks. Some of them had been making threats, and he was scared for his safety. Daniel begged me to lend him money to pay off the most dangerous debts. He said once we got our inheritance, he'd pay me back and get help for his gambling problem. I was torn between wanting to help my brother and being furious about what he'd done. The thought of him being hurt by loan sharks was terrifying, but I also knew that giving him money would just enable his addiction and probably end up funding more gambling. I told Daniel that I wasn't going to give him money, but that I'd help him find resources for gambling addiction treatment. I said if he was serious about getting clean, I'd support him through recovery. Daniel got angry and said I was abandoning him when he needed me most. He said family was supposed to stick together and that Nana Rose would be disappointed in me for not helping him. That really set me off. I told Daniel that Nana Rose would be disgusted that he'd stolen money she'd intended for our futures while she was dying. I said he'd betrayed her trust and mine, and that he needed to take responsibility for his choices. Daniel left my apartment angry, but I thought maybe some tough love would motivate him to get help. I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks. Then I got a call from my mom saying that Daniel had contacted her asking for money. She'd given him $500 and was worried about him. I told my mom about the gambling addiction and the stolen money. She was shocked and said she'd had no idea things were that bad. Over the next few weeks, Daniel contacted various family members asking for help. He told different stories to different people. Sometimes it was medical bills, sometimes job troubles, sometimes just general financial hardship. Most people gave him something, usually a few $100s. But I warned everyone I could about his gambling problem and urged them not to enable him. Some family members got angry with me for spreading Daniel's business around and said I should be more supportive. Others thanked me for the heads up and said they'd noticed Daniel seemed off lately. Meanwhile, the attorney was still working on settling Nana Rose's estate. The missing money from the joint account had created some paperwork headaches, but nothing too serious. My inheritance was delayed by a few weeks while they sorted everything out. Update: 6 weeks later. In March, I finally received my inheritance check. After legal fees and accounting for the missing money that Daniel had stolen, I ended up with about $265,000 instead of the $280,000 I'd been expecting. I was grateful for the inheritance, but angry that Daniel's actions had cost both of us money in legal fees and complications. I used part of the money to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a small house. It was something I'd been dreaming about for years, and I knew Nana Rose would have been happy to see me using her gift to build a stable future. I didn't hear from Daniel for several weeks after I got my inheritance. I figured he was probably waiting to get his own check before contacting me again. Then the attorney called with an update on Daniel's situation. Several creditors had been calling the law office trying to get information about Daniel's inheritance. The attorney had to explain that gambling debts aren't legally collectible in our state, so these people had no claim on the estate. But Daniel did owe money to some legitimate creditors, credit card companies and the like, who could potentially garnish his inheritance if they pursued it through the courts. The attorney said Daniel's portion of the estate was being held while they sorted out which debts were legitimate and which were just gambling related. Around this time, my mom started getting more frequent calls from Daniel asking for help. She said he sounded increasingly desperate and that she was worried he might be living on the streets. She asked me if I'd reconsider helping him, at least enough to get him into a stable housing situation. I told her that Daniel needed professional help for his addiction, not money that would just disappear into his gambling habit. My mom said she understood my position, but that she couldn't stand the thought of her son being homeless. She started sending Daniel money regularly, usually $200 or $300 at a time. I tried to explain to her that she was enabling his addiction, but she said she couldn't help herself. She was his mother and couldn't just let him suffer. Other family members were also getting regular requests for help from Daniel. My aunt gave him $1,000 to get back on his feet. My cousin lent him money for job interview clothes. My uncle paid for a week in a motel when Daniel said he was sleeping in his car. Everyone kept thinking that if they just helped him this one time, he'd get his life together. But the requests kept coming, and Daniel's situation kept getting worse. Update: 10 weeks later. In early May, I was at home one evening when I heard someone pounding on my front door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Daniel standing on my porch. He looked even worse than the last time I'd seen him. His clothes were filthy and torn. He was obviously malnourished, and he had what looked like a black eye and some bruises on his face. When I opened the door, he immediately started begging me to let him stay with me. He said he'd been living in his car for weeks, but it had finally broken down completely. He'd been sleeping in parks and under bridges, and he was desperate. Daniel said some of the people he owed money to had found him and roughed him up as a warning. He was terrified that they were going to seriously hurt him if he didn't come up with money soon. He begged me to let him sleep on my couch for just a few nights while he figured out his next move. He promised he wasn't asking for money, just a safe place to stay. Looking at my brother in that condition was heartbreaking. He was clearly at rock bottom, and part of me wanted to take him in and try to help him. But during our conversation, he mentioned having been at a casino just 3 days earlier, trying to win enough for a hotel room. He was still actively gambling and wasn't ready to get clean. I told Daniel that I couldn't let him stay at my house unless he agreed to enter a treatment program for gambling addiction. I said I'd help him find a program and would support him through recovery, but I wouldn't just provide him with a base of operations to continue gambling. Daniel got angry. "You're my sister. Family is supposed to help each other no matter what. Family isn't supposed to steal from each other either," I shot back. "You stole from Nana Rose while she was dying, Daniel. You lied to me for months." He started crying and begging, saying he had nowhere else to go. He said he tried calling everyone in the family and that most people were no longer taking his calls. I felt terrible, but I held firm. I told him that there were homeless shelters and social services that could help him and that I'd drive him to any treatment facility he wanted to enter. "I'm not ready for treatment," he said. I just need some time to get back on my feet. That's exactly why I can't help you. You're still planning to gamble instead of getting help. Daniel got angry again and said some really hurtful things. He said I was selfish and that I cared more about money than family. He said Nana Rose would be ashamed of me for turning my back on him. Finally, he left. I watched from my window as he walked down the street, carrying a small backpack that apparently contained all his possessions. I cried for about an hour after he left. Even though I knew I'd made the right choice, it was still incredibly painful to turn away my own brother when he was clearly suffering. Update: 3 weeks later. The fallout from turning Daniel away was immediate and intense. Within 24 hours, I started getting angry phone calls from family members. My mom was the first to call. She was crying and said she couldn't believe I'd turned Daniel away when he was homeless and desperate. I don't care what he's done, she said. He's still my son and your brother. I tried to explain my reasoning, but she cut me off. I don't want to hear it. You're being cold and vindictive, and I'm ashamed of you. My aunt called next. The family is disgusted with your behavior, she said. You've lost perspective on what's really important. Several cousins texted me saying they couldn't believe I'd let Daniel stay on the streets. One of them said I was dead to her and that she never wanted to see me again. The only family member who supported my decision was my Uncle Mark, who had struggled with alcoholism for years before getting sober. He said that enabling addicts never helps them and that sometimes tough love is the only thing that works. But most of the relatives thought I should have taken Daniel in regardless of his addiction. The worst part was that Daniel was telling everyone a completely different version of what happened. According to him, he'd come to me for help after being robbed and beaten, and I turned him away out of spite over some minor money issues. He wasn't telling people about his gambling addiction or the fact that he'd stolen money from Nana Rose. He was painting himself as a victim of circumstance who just needed temporary help from his heartless sister. Even some family members who knew about the gambling problem thought I should have helped him anyway. Addiction is a disease, my aunt said. Daniel can't help himself. I understood that perspective, but I also knew that giving him a safe place to stay would just make it easier for him to continue gambling. He told me straight up that he wasn't ready for treatment. The family drama was taking a toll on me. I started avoiding family gatherings and stopped answering calls from certain relatives. It was painful to have people I'd always been close to treating me like a villain. Update: 2 months later. In July, I got a call from a hospital about 20 miles away. Daniel had been admitted to their emergency room after collapsing on the street from dehydration and malnutrition. The hospital social worker said Daniel had listed me as his emergency contact and asked if I could come in to discuss his situation. When I got to the hospital, Daniel was asleep in a bed hooked up to an 4. The social worker explained that he'd been brought in by paramedics after someone found him unconscious near a bus stop. They treated him for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and several infected wounds that he'd apparently been ignoring. The social worker said it was clear that Daniel had been living rough for quite some time. When Daniel woke up and saw me, he immediately started apologizing. I'm ready to get help, he said. Please give me another chance. But when I asked him specifically about gambling addiction treatment, he said he thought he could handle the gambling problem on his own if he just had a stable place to live and maybe a little financial help to get back on his feet. That told me everything I needed to know. Daniel still wasn't ready to admit that he had an addiction that required professional treatment. He still thought his problem was just bad luck or poor circumstances. I told the social worker that I couldn't take Daniel home with me because of his untreated addiction. She said she understood and that they'd connect him with social services to help him find transitional housing and treatment resources. Daniel got angry again. You're abandoning me in my darkest hour. But I'd already made peace with my decision. I wasn't going to enable his addiction just because he was in bad physical condition. The social worker was actually supportive of my position. She said family members of addicts often made situations worse by trying to help without addressing the underlying addiction. Daniel was discharged to a homeless shelter a few days later. The social worker gave him information about gambling addiction treatment programs, but he never followed up on any of them. Update: 4 months later. The rest of the summer was relatively quiet. I heard occasional updates about Daniel through family members, but he stopped contacting me directly. My mom continued sending him money, despite my warnings about enabling his addiction. I know you're probably right, she said, but I can't help myself. I'm his mother. In September, Daniel's inheritance situation was finally resolved. Most of his money went to legitimate creditors who had obtained court judgments against him. After legal fees and debt payments, he received about $18,000 from what should have been a $280,000 inheritance. According to my mom, Daniel spent the entire $18,000 in less than 2 weeks. She didn't say specifically how, but I assumed it had gone to gambling and paying off immediate debts. Around this time, several family members started admitting privately that they thought I'd been right about not enabling Daniel. His behavior had become increasingly erratic, and he was burning bridges with almost everyone who'd tried to help him. My aunt, who had been one of my harshest critics, called to apologize. She said Daniel had borrowed $2,000 from her in August, promising to pay it back within a month. When she asked him about it in September, he hung up on her and hadn't returned her call since. Similar stories started coming out from other relatives. Daniel had borrowed money from almost everyone in the family with promises to pay it back, but he never repaid anyone. People were starting to realize that his problems went deeper than just temporary bad luck, and that giving him money wasn't actually helping him. Update: 8 months later. In January, almost a year after Daniel had first shown up at my door, I got another late-night phone call from him. This time, he sounded different. Instead of the desperate, manic energy I'd gotten used to, he sounded exhausted and defeated. "I think I finally hit rock bottom," he said. "I got arrested for trying to break into a car looking for money. Spending 3 days in jail was a wake-up call." Daniel said he'd found a residential gambling addiction treatment program that would take him, but he needed someone to co-sign for the costs since he had no money and terrible credit. "I'm not asking to stay with you or for cash," he said, "just for you to guarantee payment for treatment. I understand why you turned me away before, and I respect your boundaries." I was skeptical, but something about his tone made me think this might be genuine. He sounded humbled in a way I'd never heard before. I told him I'd think about it and call him back. Then I spent several days researching the treatment facility and talking to people who understood addiction. The program Daniel had found was legitimate and had good success rates. It was a 6-month residential program that cost about $25,000, but they offered payment plans and would work with families on financial arrangements. I also talked to my Uncle Mark, who'd been sober for 8 years. He said that some addicts needed to hit absolute rock bottom before they were ready to change, and that an arrest was often the wake-up call that motivated people to seek real help. After a lot of consideration, I decided to co-sign for Daniel's treatment. But I made it clear that this was the last time I'd help him financially, and that if he left treatment early or relapsed afterward, he couldn't count on further support from me. Daniel agreed to all my conditions and entered the treatment program a week later. Update: 6 months later. Daniel completed the residential treatment program in July. It was the first time in over 2 years that he'd gone more than a few days without gambling. The program had been intensive, involving group therapy, individual counseling, financial planning classes, and job skills training. Daniel had to confront the psychological reasons behind his addiction and develop healthier coping mechanisms. When he graduated from the program, Daniel called to thank me for giving him the opportunity to get clean. He said he understood why I'd had to set boundaries and that my refusal to enable him had probably saved his life. He'd gotten a job through the treatment program's placement service and was living in a sober living facility. He was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times a week and working with a sponsor. Daniel also apologized sincerely for stealing from Nana Rose and for all the lies he'd told to the family. He said he wanted to make amends to everyone he'd hurt, but that he understood it would take time to rebuild trust. I was cautiously optimistic. Daniel seemed genuinely different, more humble and self-aware than I'd seen him in years. But I also knew that addiction recovery was an ongoing process and that relapses were common. I told him I was proud of him for completing treatment and that I'd support his recovery efforts. But I also maintained my boundaries about not providing financial help beyond the treatment costs. Final update: 1 year later. Daniel has now been clean from gambling for over a year. He's been consistently attending meetings, working his recovery program, and maintaining steady employment. He moved out of the sober living facility into his own small apartment about 6 months ago. He drives an old used car that he bought with cash and lives very modestly while he rebuilds his financial life. Daniel has been making genuine efforts to repair his relationships with family members. He's paid back some of the smaller amounts he borrowed from relatives, even though it meant living extremely frugally. He wrote letters of apology to everyone he'd stolen from or lied to, taking full responsibility for his actions without making excuses or asking for forgiveness. Some family members have been more receptive than others. My mom was quick to welcome him back, while my aunt is still cautious but warming up to him again. I've slowly rebuilt a relationship with Daniel, but it's different than it was before. There's still love there, but there's also a new understanding about the importance of healthy boundaries. Daniel doesn't ask for financial help and is careful not to put anyone in uncomfortable positions. He seems to get that trust has to be rebuilt over time through consistent actions, not just words. Last month, on the anniversary of Nana Rose's death, Daniel and I visited her grave together. He brought flowers and spent a long time talking to her headstone, apologizing for betraying her trust and promising to honor her memory by staying clean. It was emotional for both of us, but it also felt like a turning point. For the first time in years, I felt like I had my brother back. Daniel still faces challenges in his recovery. He'll always be a gambling addict, even if he's not actively gambling. He has to be vigilant about avoiding triggers and maintaining his support systems. But he's proven that he can stay clean when he's motivated and has the right resources. The treatment program gave him tools to manage his addiction, and the consequences of his choices gave him the motivation to use those tools. I'm glad I stuck to my boundaries during his darkest period, even though it was incredibly difficult. Enabling his addiction wouldn't have helped him in the long run, and might have prevented him from reaching the rock bottom that finally motivated him to get help. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. It's painful to watch someone you care about suffer, but sometimes that suffering is necessary for them to find the motivation to change. Daniel and I are both still working on rebuilding our relationship and our family dynamics. The gambling addiction affected everyone who cared about him, and recovery is a process for the whole family, not just the addict. But I'm hopeful about the future. Daniel has shown that he can change when he's ready to do the work. And I've learned that I can support someone's recovery without sacrificing my own well-being or values. The inheritance that brought this whole situation to light ended up being both a blessing and a curse. It gave me financial security, but it also revealed the depth of Daniel's problems and forced our family to confront some painful truths. In the end, though, I think Nana Rose would be proud of how things turned out. She always valued responsibility, and Daniel's recovery shows that people can change when they're ready to do the work. The money she left us was meant to help us build better lives, and that's exactly what it did, just not in the way any of us expected.